For some time, it began to seem to Kostya that he was gradually losing his mind. Of course, working as a pathologist in a morgue, you can really go crazy. But the reason was not at all in the corpses that he encountered daily, but in his new assistant Vlad. Some strange things really happened to him, and Kostya, being an attentive person, had long since lost his peace. Vlad came to the city morgue after his career as a surgeon was put a fat cross. He himself was a man of few words and never talked about his past. The orderlies in the morgue whispered that after all the operations that he performed, people died sooner or later. Come on. I think it's just a common coincidence. Surely, more experienced surgeons gave him hopeless patience in order not to cast a shadow on his career. Kostya defended his future colleague. Then, he did not yet know what he would soon have to face. Vlad was a thin, tall guy in whose eyes it was impossible to read any emotions. He went to work with the same backpack on his back and, according to rumors, lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. Outwardly, Vlad left a not very pleasant impression, a sloping forehead, sunken cheeks, and eyes under which circles always blackened from lack of sleep. At first, he was quite normal. He could easily determine the cause of death and make a jewelry incision, which, after stitching, was not visible at the funeral in an open coffin. Otherwise, he was a gloomy and uncommunicative guy who, apparently, was not interested in anything but corpses. Vlad could dig into them for a very long time, several times taking out the internal organs and examining them in the light of a powerful halogen lamp hanging over his head. It sometimes seemed to Kostya that even a moment and he would taste them. But Vlad, of course, did not do this. Kostya tried to get him to talk, but it was all to no avail. Vlad stubbornly refused to talk about anything but corpses. Putrid, partially decomposed remains aroused in him an unhealthy interest, sometimes turning into delight. Vlad, tell me, can you think of anything other than your corpses? This is just a job and nothing more, Kostya once asked during the next autopsy. Vlad was silent for a while, and then said, "You know, I have been interested in the mystery of death since childhood. How does it happen that a person lived, and then, suddenly, once, and for some reason died?" Kostya sighed sadly and began to put a rough stitch on the ripped sternum of an elderly drunk. With this client, everything was clear and no mental reflections were required. He died of cirrhosis and that said it all. This Vlad's flask really whistles. The nurses were right. He's strange. Something, Kostya thought to himself then. On an ordinary day, when nothing resonant happened, there was little work. So, a couple of corpses of people who died of natural causes. For Kostya, such days seemed like a real freebie. Vlad, on the contrary, was gloomy at such moments and could not sit in one place for a second. He walked from corner to corner and behaved very nervously and abruptly. The orderlies laughed, calling Vlad a butcher behind his back. But Kostya, his unhealthy interest in corpses was, to put it mildly, unpleasant. But he still did not dare to talk about this to his partner openly. Everyone can have their own cockroaches in their head. But then, an event happened that turned everything upside down. It all started with the fact that in the early morning 5 corpses were brought to the morgue at once. As it turned out, the poor fellows died as a result of a terrible accident after a drunk driver fell asleep at the wheel and crashed into an oncoming heavy-duty trailer. The bodies were in such a terrible state that even burnt orderlies, at the sight of these corpses, grimaced, as if from a toothache. In order to somehow bring them into the proper form for the funeral, Kostya and Vlad had to work tirelessly. By the end of the working day, they literally fell down from fatigue. It remained to put in order 2 more bodies, but Kostya simply could not stay longer. The fact was that he had to urgently go home, because his fiancée had a birthday today. Then Vlad suggested, "And let me stay." "And what? I live alone. I have nowhere to hurry. I'll fix these poor fellows overnight. And tomorrow, you will work instead of me on the day shift, okay?" Kostya looked at his partner with disbelief, and then, nevertheless, agreed. Well, then the Magaric, my friend, threw goodbye to Kostya, knowing full well that his partner couldn't stand alcohol. Rejoicing that he managed to get off so easily, Konstantin quickly took a shower and hurried to the exit. Deep down, he was glad that he managed to sneak away and not dig with the corpses until late at night. The festive evening for Kostya went just fine, and, at some point, the guy caught himself thinking that he had not rested so mentally for a long time. By midnight, he was already on a fair poker and knew that the next morning he would have a headache. Falling into a heavy alcoholic sleep, Kostya did not even remember Vlad, who at that moment, most likely, was busy with the corpses in the morgue. All night long, Kostya had terrible dreams in which the dead came to life and pulled their decomposed limbs towards him, in which cadaveric worms were actively hosting. Only in the morning, the nightmares faded away, but he did not manage to enjoy sleep. The sharp ringing of the mobile phone pulled Kostya out of the heavy hangover that he was trying to survive by closing his eyes. "Hello?" croaked the pathologist into the phone. "Konstantin. What happened there on the night shift? The thing is, Vlad is dead. They did this to him. In general, come soon. You will see everything with your own eyes," the head of the morgue said in a trembling voice. Hearing about this, Kostya felt a terrible shiver all over his body. Vlad is dead. But what could happen to him? Especially in the building of the city morgue? Even the most notorious scumbag won't rush into a room full of corpses in the middle of the night, Kostya thought feverishly. After washing himself in ice-cold tap water, he drank an aspirin and hurried to work, where it was already full of police officers who were desperately trying to reconstruct the picture of the crime. As it turned out, around midnight, Vlad, someone masterfully cut his throat from ear to ear, and then, having ripped open the pathologist's stomach, scattered his bloody entrails throughout the sectional hall. According to the orderlies who discovered the body in the morning, there was even blood on the ceiling. The police quickly questioned Kostya, who told them that he and Vlad had agreed to switch shifts. "I can't even imagine who could have killed him," said Konstantin, suffering from a hangover. Thoughts in the guy's head swarmed like snakes in the mating season, and, no matter how much he tried, he could not concentrate. As a result, Vlad's body and personal belongings were taken to the Forensic Medical Examination Bureau, where they were to be examined from into. But Kostya had to continue the work alone. "I wonder if Vlad managed to finish the work he started?" Grimacing with a headache, he thought. The fact was that Vlad worked alone and the orderlies could not say anything definite, since only the watchman was in the mortuary building on the night shift. He was an alcoholic of retirement age, who immediately disappeared somewhere after all these events. The police immediately put the watchman on the wanted list, but Kostya was 100% sure that the watchman was out of business here. What happened here anyway? Kostya thought as he looked around the autopsy room. Although Vlad's remains had already been removed, blood streaks were still visible in places on the walls. Deciding to go all the way of his colleague from beginning to end, Kostya began to study the corpses of 5 people who died in a car accident one by one. Among them were 2 women and 3 men, one of whom was the culprit of the accident, who during his lifetime poured into himself so much alcohol that it would be enough to knock down an elephant. After examining the corpses, Kostya came to the conclusion that Vlad managed to put in order only one body. Another one, which belonged to a woman, lay untouched in the form in which death found him. The most interesting thing was that this corpse did not have severe injuries that could cause death. No, of course there were extensive hematomas and injuries, but Konstantin knew from experience that with such injuries, the victims usually survived. "So, what happened to you, beauty?" whispered the pathologist, starting to examine the body. The deceased had red, curly hair that fell in a golden cascade over her lifeless, pale shoulders. The eyes, as Kostya could hardly determine, were green. Well, a spitting witch. In the time of the Inquisition, You would have been sent to the stake, dear, he said aloud. Having decided that the reason for the death of the red-haired beauty was damage to internal tissues, Kostya proceeded to the autopsy. First of all, he made a cut, which is familiar in such cases, which vaguely resembled the letter V. The internal organs of the abdominal region were in perfect order. No breaks, no hematomas. Moreover, they did not seem cold to Kostya at all. Not really. Can't be. It all seems to me with a hangover, thought Constantine, and continued the inspection. To get to the heart, he used a special saw to cut through the chest and ribs. And here is your heart, baby, Kostya muttered and carefully touched it with the finger of his right hand, dressed in medical gloves. And then suddenly, at that very moment, Kostya felt a beating with the pad of his finger. It was simply impossible to confuse these rhythmic contractions with anything else. Out of surprise, Constantine jerked his hand back and jumped a meter away from the dissecting table. No. It's all nonsense. She is dead and I know it for sure, flashed through Kostya's head. He was about to call for help from the orderlies when the door to the dissecting room closed of its own accord. Kostya saw with his own eyes how the lock made 2 turns and froze in the closed position. God, what's going on? With horror thought the pathologist. At the same time, Kostya heard a loud slap behind him, which happens when a large piece of meat comes into contact with the glossy surface of the tile. Constantine slowly turned around and saw that the girl's corpse was already lying on the floor of the dissecting room. At the same moment, the deceased's neck snapped loudly, and her head arched at an unnatural angle. Leaving behind a trail of blood, the dead girl crawled in the direction of Kostya. The carrion's fingers, ending in sharp manicures, clenched and unclenched like the claws of a harpy. Come here, honey. Do you like me? Is not it so? Croaked the dead woman and held out her crooked hands to Kostya. No, no. Oh, you creature. Well, no, you won't take me so easily, Constantine shouted and began to look with his eyes for his favorite scalpel for long incisions. The revived corpse of the girl, meanwhile, crawled closer and closer, with each of its movements, making a sickening squelching sound. Kostya rushed to the table with the instrument, intending to grab the scalpel, but the crawling creature turned out to be more agile and, like a cobra in a rush, grabbed his leg with its teeth. Trying to free himself, the pathologist could not keep his balance and collapsed to the floor. The deceased howled triumphantly and, scattering her spilled entrails in all directions, reached for Kostya's throat. Okay, it's all over now. This is the end, flashed through the pathologist's head. Plunging into the sticky, bloody darkness, he saw out of the corner of his eye how the door of the sectional hall swung open, and several orderlies appeared on the threshold. Kostya woke up a few hours later. At first, he thought that he was in paradise, but after looking more closely, he realized that there were light hospital walls around him. For some reason, Kostya's hands and feet were handcuffed to the bed, and a gag from a bandage folded several times was in his mouth. After the guy woke up, the police entered the ward, who were already familiar to him in the case of the murder of Vlad. One of them pulled the gag out of his mouth and, without any transition, asked, "Well, tell me how it was? Or will you continue to roll? What are you speaking about? What do you allow yourself?" Breaking into a scream, yelled Kostya. "Well, if you don't want it for the good, then will be for the bad. In your colleague Vlad's backpack, we found a video camera on which he, as usual, recorded every autopsy in which he took part. We reviewed the tape and saw that around midnight, you broke into the dissection room and killed Vlad." From such an unprecedented lie, Kostya turned pale and shouted, "I couldn't be in the morgue that night. At the specified time, I celebrated my fiancée's birthday. You can easily check it." The policeman chuckled ironically, and then said, "Yeah, of course. We have already done this and made inquiries. But only your fiancée, Elena Petrova, died 5 years ago in a car accident. Yesterday, She could have turned 30 years old. 5 people died in that accident and only the driver was lucky enough to survive. And that drunken driver was you, Konstantin. After the words of the policeman, Kostya began to beat in hysterics. Then, the law enforcement officer showed the pathologist a photograph of his deceased bride. In it, Kostya easily recognized the same red-haired dead woman who, not so long ago, wanted to tear him apart. The policeman kept talking for a long time about the sluggish schizophrenia and paranoia that had been slowly taking over Kostya's mind for 5 years now. But Kostya no longer heard him. In fact, Vlad, who died at the hands of Konstantin, was not at all strange and did not enjoy the sight of corpses. Yesterday no one died in an accident, and the revived corpse of a girl was just the fruit of Kostya's sick fantasy. It was he who, having gone over with alcohol on the eve of the anniversary of the death of his fiancée, killed Vlad on the night shift and fled from the morgue, frightening the watchman to death. All this time, he slowly went crazy, remaining an ordinary person for everyone. Gradually, everyone forgot about that fatal catastrophe, the culprit of which he became due to his irresponsibility and alcoholism. But the flame of madness caused by the death of 5 people has already taken root in Kostya's brain, developing into a terrible paranoia. Now, for the murder of a colleague with particular cruelty, Konstantin faces a long sentence. But the former pathologist is not afraid of this at all. More than anything else, Kostya is afraid to see the deceased bride again, who now increasingly comes to him in nightmares.